What is it that people are seeing? Is it a man? An animal? A myth? Or something else? Are they delusional? Are they lying? Some are pastors. Some are law enforcement. Some are military. If they are delusional liars, why do we trust them to lead us to God? To put people in jail and to protect our way of life? Why are their words and actions good enough for that? But when it comes to experiencing something out of the ordinary, something fascinating, something possibly terrifying, they become a fool, a joke, an idiot. Not here. We are the Big Dog T2B. Welcome to the show. Hello everyone. My name is Jack and welcome to the Big Dog T2B. As usual, we have the founder of the Big Dog T2B, Nathan Bowling, with us. How you doing, Nate?
Oh, I'm just wonderful, Jack. You're just wonderful.
Good to hear it. And tonight we have a special guest with us, Tim Coonbo Baker. How you doing, Tim?
Doing pretty good. I'm glad to be here.
Yeah, we are too. Well, it seems that you might have fallen off the map there for a little bit. Where you been?
Well, for the last about 3 years, I've been absolutely buried at work due to a lot of different factors going on, and working a lot of average 12 to 14 hour days and some 16-hour days, and having to work nights and weekends on a fairly regular basis. And I haven't done a whole lot of research over the last couple of 3 years, but I've done some. Been doing more around here closer to home, just weekend trips and stuff. Made a motorcycle trip out through Colorado and Utah. Left on the 18th of May and got back 9 days later, the day after Memorial Day. During that trip, out the morning of the fourth day, I was walking my bike. I'm riding an off-road bike. Walking the bike down the side of a pretty steep side hill trail that came down off of a butte out in Utah and part of the Grand Staircase Escalante. And engine was off, and like I said, I was walking it down this trail that was covered with a lot of loose rock and a lot of round volcanic gravel. Make a long story short, the bike got away from me, and I slipped and tried to push the bike away, and it ended up falling and landing on my lower shin bone right above my ankle and fracturing it in 2 places. But I did some field first aid, wrapped it up, and put my boot back on, tightened up a few extra notches, and went on. I rode for 6 more days after that. We were 60 miles back in the middle of nowhere, and if I had not have been able to do that, I would have had to have been airlifted out of there. You couldn't even get in there with a Jeep where we were. I got to use some of my old field first aid skills and patch myself up pretty good. I'll throw a plug in here for Alpine Star Corazal riding boots. They're really good. If I hadn't had a boot of that quality on, I would have had to have been airlifted out of there. Anyway, so since the day after Memorial Day, I've been laid up with a broken leg, and I had surgery on it 1st of June. I've got a plate and collection of screws in there now, but I'm doing all right.
God bless you.
Yeah.
When you get out there and you're doing the thing, some folks can lay down and give up, and some folks don't.
I've never been one to give up.
Life gives you the experience to handle those kinds of things.
Yeah.
Unless you handle those kinds of things for other folks too.
Yes, I have.
And I know how you feel. You spend a lot of time out there doing what you have to do so you can have just a few minutes to go and do what you want to do.
Exactly. But while I was on that trip, I was keeping my eyes and ears open for a Bigfoot sign and vocalizations. And actually, in one area there, right off the Arkansas River, in a particular place in Colorado, myself and there was two of us right together at this point. We both heard a number of vocalizations, even though this gentleman is not a Bigfoot researcher or anything like that. He knew enough when he heard it. He knew that that wasn't any kind of a normal animal that he'd ever seen or heard of. And this is a fella that has spent untold thousands of hours in the boonies. After he met me, he did a little bit of reading and studying, and he agreed that based on what he'd heard from me plus some other people, that we were in some pretty good habitat for that part of the country. But we heard, like I said, we heard some pretty good vocalizations at this place. And while we were out in Utah, we were so far back in the middle of nowhere, and we were off on foot sometimes exploring around, and I kept my eyes and ears open there as well, of course, and didn't see anything. In fact, we were at one place where there had been some sightings in the past. I looked pretty carefully around that place and didn't find anything. Talked to a few people. Surprisingly, several people that I talked to, had stories to tell, either that had happened to them or had happened to family members or such. So it was a fun trip, and for two different reasons. I'm looking forward to going back out there.
One of the videos that we have out is pictures of you and Dee and a few of the other folks out there on an outing, and in the background, there's an anomaly there.
Mm-hmm.
And I put in that video, does Coonbo look for boogers, or do boogers look for Coonbo? And that's a good question, right?
Uh-huh.
There's a lot to be said about senses, and I've gone into that on some other folks' shows. And most people have had a dog, and when you walk in and your dog, you can be in a bad mood. It's nothing about the way you're walking or talking or anything like that. But your dog knows it.
Mm-hmm.
And there's a lot to be said about matter and the resonant frequency of matter, slow-moving energy. And I've wondered a lot of times if in some way encountering these things change people in a way that's perceivable by them.
I believe it does, because when I've talked to countless people who had been either full-blown skeptics or had never thought a thing in the world about Bigfoot, from all walks of life, and when they had their first encounter and actually saw one, it just like opened their mind up, or it opened their eyes. And you'd be amazed how often that once a person has seen one, how many of them will see another one. And it's like once they've ever seen one, that it's a lot easier for them to recognize and see other ones down the road. It's not that a person sees one and then they're seeing one everywhere they look, that there's one behind every tree. It's not that. I've known a couple of people that were that way, that they're taking all kind of tons of pictures and say, oh, there's a booger down there, or there's a Bigfoot over here. Look at it. It's looking out from behind that rock. Nah. I mean, there's a few people like that, but the majority, it shakes them up so much. A lot of them don't want to see another one, but they do later on. That's a very common occurrence.
I have had this very conversation with several people, and I have found like people don't understand how. I mean, they're automatically a skeptic when I talk about the number of experiences I've had. They
Right.
like, well, nobody has, but you do. It's just that thing. It's just like you were talking about. It's like, and maybe something to what Jack's saying. Maybe it tags you in a way that they feel more comfortable allowing you
Mm-hmm.
to see them because, you know, there was a time across the road here. There was 16 or 18 months that I could go across the road here from my house any given time and have some kind of interaction with a booger. Now it's not so much now. I feel like they've moved on, and I feel like I know the reason for it, which we've discussed that on the show before. But I 100% agree how because some people go a lifetime and never see one.
Mm-hmm.
Some people have multiple encounters, and
Mm-hmm.
there's got to be something to that.
Right. And what surprises me is, the number of serious researchers that have never seen one. And I don't know if it's because they're not going to the right people or they haven't been to the right place or what, but they just haven't seen one. And I'd like to take some of those guys and take them out, take them to a place where I, believe we could camp for 3 or 4 days, and if they don't get to see one, they're at least going to be really, really, really close to one. They'll get to hear more stuff than they've ever heard in a short period of time. And that's not a brag or anything like that. It's just a fact. I'm not special or anything. There's a lot of researchers out there that are just as good as I am. Know just as much as I do. In fact, I've got one of my best friends, Troy Allen. He's down in Georgia. He knows as much or more about boogers as anybody I know. He grew up with them. Was raised by his grandparents and grew up on a farm where they had been habituated on that farm for generations. And I know other people that are from situations like that. Now, bad things can come of that and have come of that and have come from that kind of thing. And Troy knows he would never do anything like that now. But the thing about it is, growing up in that kind of environment, he's been around them, close contact around them more than I have down in South Georgia and Northwest Florida. But I researched now. Forget how many states I'm up to, but I'm up close to 40 states that I've. In fact, it may be at 40 states that I've researched in, and plus part of Canada.
So I brought that up as a lead into a joke that's become a little popular.
Uh-huh.
And it's about the woo. I don't really
Mm-hmm.
put the woo on my radar. And this is why. Portals, mind speak, that kind of stuff.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't deny that it happens. There
Mm-hmm.
are good folks, honest folks, reputable folks
Mm-hmm.
that have this as a part of their experience and as a part of their life. And there's no way that I would ever hold the water to say that what they're saying is not true. But the reason I don't put it on my radar is I'm a worst case scenario kind of guy.
Mm-hmm.
Now, what if one night in my bedroom I'm in the saddle and Bigfoot booger jumps through a portal into my bedroom and I turn around and there's Bigfoot doing the voyeur thing, mind speaking to me about how he wants to make me the white in an Oreo. That's bad.
No, only you would think of that.
That's real bad.
Yeah.
Yep, that'll scar you right there. But I brought that in because that brushes into the woo thing. And for a long time, you were the absolute science, numbers, biology, behavioral patterns associated with these things. And I think that you've come to grips and embraced some of what folks might consider the woo factor associated with them. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yes. And I know there's going to be people out there that are going to say, "Oh, Coonbo's gone off the deep end. He's gone over to the dark side, or he's lost his mind." Well, let me tell you, if you research these things long enough and spend enough time in the field, you're going to have experiences that you can't explain and that are totally outside the box of what you've come to believe. And some of you that are listening to this have heard me say this before, but I'm telling you, from being a senior engineer working on everything from nuclear power plants to nuclear propulsion systems for ships and submarines to nuclear weapons, later on working for NASA and as a R&D, research development and test engineer, working in mission control on multiple shuttle missions, personally knowing a lot of the astronauts. I was in mission control when the Challenger blew up. I held a top secret clearance for 31 years. Traveled all over this country. I've been out of this country. I've been on all kind of military installations. And one of the things that pretty quickly amazed me is how many of these military installations around the country have a significant Bigfoot population on them. And I was utterly astounded the first time I went to Edwards Air Force Base in California to learn that it's a small, but there is a small Bigfoot population at Edwards Air Force Base. And the security people out there know each individual one of them. They don't talk to them or anything like that, but they know which ones frequent what areas and such. And they know to keep their eye out for them. They train the security people out there not to shoot at them. And it's that way on many, many, many government installations around the country. But during all my time of researching, one of the things that has kept coming back to me is that if you're a decent researcher at all, you can't be just hard-headed and set in your ways. You've got to be willing to relook at your evidence, relook at your data, and reevaluate your data with a different set of filters. Or there's statistics and there's statistics. There's data and there's data. You can manipulate it a lot of different ways, but you've got to go back. And one of the things that I discovered, the very first report that I ever took from somebody, other than sightings around where I grew up on, the farm I grew up on, the very first report that I ever took, that I actually wrote the report down and interviewed the people that had the sighting, I wrote it up as a Bigfoot sighting. They kept telling me little things that didn't quite jive up with what I knew about Bigfoot and the Bigfoot that I'd been seeing on my farm since I was 4 years old, and encounters that I, personally had with them on my farm as well as other places. But the sum of my experience was just this one type of Bigfoot. And at that time, I didn't know that there are what we call the type 1 and the type 2s that, I had to come up with some kind of a classification. The type 1 are the big ones of the patty type that are in the one that's in the Patterson-Gimlin film, that are the big 10-foot tall alpha males or taller, huge, massively bulky bodies and all. And then there is the type 2 that's more prevalent in the eastern and southern parts of the United States. Some people call them swamp apes and such as that. But they're a little bit lighter built. They're not quite as tall, but they're actually more numerous than the type 1s. And odd thing is, I know they could interbreed, but I've been researching these things in areas for decades, and they maintain separate populations within a given area. There is a 300 square mile area that I monitor closely, and I go in and I use the latest methods for counting the Bigfoot in that area. I use the same methods that the Forest Service and Audubon Society and different groups use for counting rare animals and rare birds. And I keep track of where the different troops are, the different family units are within this 300-mile area. In the type 1, there is one type 1 troop or family unit in this 300 square mile area, and it's always occupied the same place. And it's been there since back in the 1990s. That's when I first started studying this area. And from talking with the locals and such, they've been there for generations. And they maintain a separate. They have not interbred or mixed, at least not enough to wipe out their genetic distinction. So that was a whole learning thing for me to realize that there were type 1s and type 2s. And then I kept hearing more reports about this something else that was out there. And finally, I had to recognize that there was something out there that we now refer to as a dog man. Well, in the early 2000s, late 1990s, early 2000s, I got to looking at some of my data, going back looking at a bunch of my old sighting reports that I had written up, and I realized that the people that I had interviewed in that report, that what they had described, it didn't jive with what I knew at that time as a type 1 or a type 2. And I'm thinking, some of the phrases he used and descriptions that they used of how the thing moved and how it walked and such as that, and how it looked, sounds like a dog man. So I go back 20-something years later and find a couple of those people from that first sighting report, and I re-interviewed them. And I showed them pictures of a dog man. And by golly, that's what it was. I mean, they instantly, I showed them Bigfoot pictures, and which I didn't have any Bigfoot pictures back in 1978 or 79. I think it was 78 or 79 when I did that first report. I didn't have any pictures. So I go back and I show them pictures of Bigfoot, type 1s and type 2s. Nope, that's not it. And so then I put down a dog man picture, both of them. And this was from separate interviews. That's it. I had to admit that my very first report that I ever took, I had it misclassified. But at that time, I didn't know that dog man even existed. So I have reevaluated a lot of my past research numbers of times and gone back looking. I'll talk to somebody and they'll say something that flips a bit in my memory, and I'm thinking, I've heard this before. And I'll go back and dig, and I can find something that corroborates that, even though at the time I didn't give it much credence because it was outside of what I knew about them at the time. So I'll say it again. Any researcher worth his salt, is worth anything, has got to have an open mind and has got to be able to look at the data from different angles and reevaluate his own data, and has got to be willing to change his previous theories or change his previous beliefs about things. So I was through most of my life and most of my research, I was firmly flesh and blood. And I didn't believe a lot of the woo stuff that, quote, woo, unquote, stuff that I was hearing out there. And still don't believe a lot of it. But there are some things that, that I have encountered, that I have discussed with other researchers that I trust, and that other researchers that I trust have come to me with and asked and told me what they'd seen or heard, and asked me if I'd ever seen or heard anything like it. And that's what I want to talk about in this episode here. And I've known a gentleman since back in the early 2000s he goes by the name of Tal Branco. And he is a world traveling researcher. He has literally been all over the world as part of his job. He worked for a lot of aluminum companies searching for the ore and all the materials that they have to make aluminum. Aluminum ore is called bauxite, but then they have to have other things that they blend with it as they smelt the ore. He's traveled over to the Eastern Hemisphere and all over the Western Hemisphere, South America, the Amazon basin. My gosh, I can't even think of all the places he's traveled over there in Europe and Asia and places like that. But he's like me. He wasn't over there research Bigfoot. He was over there for another business purpose. But like me, he's kept his eyes and ears open. And like me, when he's back here, he has researched extensively. And I had heard about this gentleman for a long time before I ever had any contact with him, but we turned out to both be members of the old Alabama Bigfoot Research Forum that's now defunct, Mike McLean, that started it. And we were both personal friends with Mike. And that's how we first met. Now, we never met in person, but we talked quite a bit on the phone. We emailed back and forth a lot, texted on phones. We talked back and forth on the forums and things. And our friendship has grown over the years. And here last year, we had tried to get together numbers of times and things just didn't work out. And last year, I had some time and he had some time. So I took off and drove down to Arkansas to his home, and I spent 2 days down there. And we talked about a lot of things. We shared notes. And I was really surprised that some of the weird experiences he had were very similar to weird experiences that I had or that I had heard about from other people. We were wanting to have Tal on this show, but was not able to make it. So he asked me to share this story or this report on this episode here. And it's a lead-in to what we're talking about here. He said, this thing here, he said, it shook him to the core when he got involved in this. And personally researching in this area, and after talking to this gentleman. Now, the person that originally contacted him with this report is a police officer down in Arkansas, and he's a very well respected person in the community and in the area. And he's a straight shooter. He's not a BSer at all. He's a very serious person. He's also an avid hunter, and he owns some property in a very remote area of the Ouachita Mountains in southwestern Arkansas. All right. So he contacted Tal and told him this story. To get to this property, you have to drive to a small public lake down there in southwest Arkansas, and then there is just an old sort of a mountain road that if you have a four-wheel drive, a good four-wheel drive vehicle or an ATV or a dirt bike, you can follow this road for several miles away from this lake property and up into the mountains. And it gets rougher and rougher the further you go. And you eventually get to a place where you can't even take a four-wheeled vehicle. And now the place has been logged off and stuff. Of course, that was done with dozers and, well, log skidders, and those things can go just about anywhere. I mean, they can go nearly as many places or sometimes more places than a tracked vehicle can go. It was muzzleloader season, and this was somewhere around the hunting season, the 2008, 2009 hunting season, or it was the 2009, 2010 hunting season. One or the other. I'm not sure which. I didn't write that detail down. What happened with him was he hiked into this place, and from the place that you had, as far as he could go in his truck, he walks in another mile or so, and then he crosses a creek, and his property is on the side of a fairly steep mountain. And at the base of this mountain, on his property, they had logged off an area down there of about 20, maybe 25 acres, 30 acres, say at the most, or it certainly was not a square 40. And it could have been no more than about 40 acres in a rectangular strip that sort of wrapped around the base of the mountain. But there was an area there it was probably, from the description, it sounds like it was 20 to 25 acres. And that the long side of this rectangle followed the edge of the creek. And if anybody's been around logging areas, back in mountainous areas, you're not allowed to log right up to the creek bank. You have to maintain a strip of what they call riparian habitat to protect the creek bank from erosion. So there was probably a 20 to 30 yard wide strip of uncut timber along the creek. But then where the logged area started going up the hill, it got fairly steep. Again, there are limits on how steep they will let you log land now. Because if you log on some of these, really steep 45 degrees angle or 100% grade surfaces, you're going to create a lot of erosion. So you just can't log off a whole mountain anymore. They just don't allow that because of the damage it does to the environment. So up above this logged off area, there were two big quartzite rock outcroppings that overlooked the clear-cut area. And they are very large outcroppings. You can walk up in between these two outcroppings, and you get up there about 200 yards up the side of the mountain above this cutover area, and you get to a place where you can look out and see this entire, most all of the cutover area. And so he built a tree stand up there, or either set up a tree stand up there in between these two outcroppings. And so he's up there during muzzleloader season, and he's watching the cutover area. Now, it's a long shot for a muzzleloader down to there, but at this point in time, long-range muzzleloaders had been developed, and he had a muzzleloading rifle that was capable of shooting about anything from his tree stand to make a clean shot on about anything that was almost anywhere in that cutover area. So he's sitting up there in his tree stand, and somewhere over on the mountainside, on the other side of the outcropping to his right, he hears all of a sudden this god-awful yelling and screaming and stuff start up. He said he's heard weird things up there, and he said, and the guy freely admitted that back before he became, when he was younger, he said he was pretty feral. And he said back up in those hills and stuff, he said he'd shot about everything up there. He said he'd killed, hogs, deer, turkey, bears, bobcats. And he said he even, you know, way back, like in the 60s or very early 70s, he had even killed a cougar up there. And back before he knew that they were protected. And he's seen and heard about everything, but he said he'd never heard anything like this. And he said the noise was unbelievable. And he said he could tell it was coming down the side of the mountain, but it was on the other side of this rock outcropping. And he said at some point he began to hear limbs and stuff crashing and breaking and things being slammed around. And he said all of a sudden, popping out or thrashing through the woods, he said it got down to a point where he could see down into the timber past the outcropping, and he could see limbs shaking and small trees being bashed into and banged into. And he said all of a sudden, rolling and stumbling out into this field, into the cutover area, two Bigfoot. And he said they were monstrously large. I mean, absolutely enormous. And he said they're fighting. And he said it's an ungodly fight. He said, but one of them is getting the advantage over the other one. And he said that this one kept trying to run away, and the other one would run it down and knock the hell out of it, and then jump on it, and they were thrashing all over the ground and ripping and tearing at each other and screaming and roaring and everything. He said it was absolutely unbelievable, the viciousness of the fight and how loud it was. And he said it got to a point, the one that was getting his ass whipped got to his feet, and rather than running, he turned around to face the one that was attacking him, and they sort of faced off there for a second. And he said all of a sudden, he said he could see, and he was watching them, and he said all of a sudden, he said he saw it in their faces. Now mind you, he's got either a scope or a good pair of binoculars that he's watching them through. I can't remember which one. And he said he could see their faces, and he said suddenly they came to the realization that they were out in the open in this cutover area. And he said both of them, they were sort of shocked, just looked sort of surprised, and they quit fighting. And he said they turned around and started walking down the hill side by side. And he said the things were absolute twins of each other. He said they very well could have been full brothers, or they could have been twins. He said they looked absolutely identical, and they were sort of a brownish color. They walked down the hill, and they get to the area where the police officer had crossed the creek on the old logging road and come up the hill into the field and then veered off up in between the rock outcroppings. He said when they got to the place where he had crossed the creek, he said both of them stopped. And he said that they just stand there, and he said that one of them is sitting there looking across the creek and looking all in the trees and looking around. He said the other one, and he said it spun around and it instantly made eye contact with him. And he said he's 200 yards away. And he's in full camo up in a camouflage tree stand. He said that thing spun around and instantly made eye contact with him. And he said it scared him so bad that if he'd have had even the slightest inkling that he wanted to try to shoot at this thing, he said he couldn't have controlled the rifle. He said he was shaking so bad that he was scared that he was going to drop the rifle. He said when that thing made eye contact with him, he said that thing's eyes just bored into him. And he said it absolutely affected him to his core. He said both of them just froze. He said he knew that there was no way that he could kill either one of those things if they had attacked him. And he said there's no way that he was going to kill it anyway. He said that, they were obviously intelligent creatures. And he sat there totally terrified that they were, one or the other of them was going to charge up the hill after him. But he said they didn't. He said the one that had spun around looking at him, he said he turned the other way. He said across the creek, back when they had logged it off, that they would drag the logs over there across the creek, and there was an area there that was just wide enough that they could get a truck in there at the time, a logging truck or something. And they had torn the woods up and, knocked down a bunch of trees, and then they had gone off and left it after they finished logging it. And it had grown up. If anybody knows about areas that have been logged off, it grew up in impenetrable briars and a bunch of vines and saplings and such. He said that, and there was a bunch of wild grapevines growing all through it. He said it was absolutely impenetrable to a human. He said both of those Bigfoot took off across the creek, and his exact words were that they dissolved into that thicket, that impenetrable thicket of briars and saplings and vines. Now, these briars are bigger around than your thumb, and they grow 9-10 feet tall or taller. Probably down there next to, in that good bottomland, they're probably 11-12 feet tall or better. They're stout enough and everything that if you're in there, if you try to bush hog down some of that, they will literally, if they get a hold of you, they will drag you off of a tractor. I mean, they are that stout and that strong. They will tear a human to shreds. And I mean, if you don't believe me, I can take you to a piece of ground that we logged off a few years ago, and I'll throw you out in the middle of it and see if you can get out of it. Or I'll wrap $100 bill around a rock, and I'll throw it about 20 feet off there, and I'll let you have it if you can get it.
Nate can attest to this.
Yeah.
I'm surrounded by it here in Maryland.
Mm-hmm.
You know what I'm talking about.
Absolutely.
So now the words were, and Tal said at the time, he just thought that they ran into this. But there are a lot of eyewitness reports of these things running into cutover and just running through it wide ass open. And a person couldn't even wiggle their way through there on their hands and knees. And I mean, I have personally seen that several times where somehow they just charge through it. I've seen them run through it at 20, 25 miles an hour. I got charged one time out of one that was down in some of that stuff. And we were standing up in the back of a truck trying to shoot coyotes. And when this thing started screaming and charged us, we looked around, and this thing was making a wake through that cutover, just like the velociraptors did in the first Jurassic Park movie, where they're out in that big grass field and the velociraptors are attacking them in that high grass. That's what this looked like, this one thing that charged us through about a 7 or 8 year old cutover. I mean, it's absolutely impenetrable to humans. And it was blowing through it at 25 miles an hour, thereabouts. But he said that these things went hauling butt across that creek and into that briar, vine, and sapling thicket. And he said they never broke pace, but he said that they dissolved into it instantly. And he said they did not even move a leaf. He said they left no wake. It was like they just vaporized. Now, Tal had taken note of that when he did the report, but he just really didn't. He's thinking, well, that's just a figure of speech or something. Well, he over the years heard some other reports like that, where people described them running into things and just sort of dissolving. But now let me tell you what happened. The rest of the story. The guy gave Tal permission to go up there and investigate on the property. And he wasn't interested in going back up there himself. He was shaken up so bad. So one thing led to another, and Tal didn't get back up there until July of 2010. And the day he went up there, it was 104 degrees. He took a pack with him. He said mostly what he had in the pack was water. And he had a couple of game cams. Once he got there, he looked up between those rock outcroppings. He saw a good area there where he wanted to set up this game cam up high on a tree that was on the edge of a ledge that would look out over and see a large part of that field. And it was a expensive game cam with a long range sensor on it. And he said that this mountainside there was so steep, he said it literally took him over an hour to get from the edge of the cutover up into the woods where he wanted to put the game cam. It was so steep and rough and rugged. And he said he finally got it up there, and he finally got the thing hung. And he came back down the hill, and he said by this time it was so hot, and he had hiked back in there so far that he was absolutely worn out. Now, Tal is way up in his 70s now. So he was in his late 60s at that time. And he had already had a pacemaker at that time. So when he got that one game cam placed and came down the side of the mountain, crossed the cutover field, went down and crossed the creek. He said once he got down and across the creek and into the woods where it was shady and close to that creek where it was a lot cooler, he said he was absolutely worn out. He sat down on a big old sweet gum log that was there, and he said the log had been there long enough that the bark had rotted and fallen off of it. He said it was a good smooth log to sit on, and he sat down on it, but it was more rotten than he thought. He said the thing snapped all of a sudden and dropped down about 18 inches and onto the ground and made another big loud snap, but came to a stop. But he said it was even more comfortable to sit on at that point, so he said he just sat there. And he said he'd been sitting there for about 15 minutes trying to cool off. And by this time, he had drunk most of the water that he brought with him. So he didn't want to chug-a-lug what little he had left. So he was just sitting there trying to, in the shade next to that creek, trying to cool off. And he said not long after that thing snapped, he heard a crack. And he said this sounded like a big green tree limb snap. Like any of us that have researched very much has heard this, where they will, it's sort of as an intimidation deal, they'll get off out in there where you can't see them, and they'll snap off a green tree limb. And I mean, you hear like a pow. And he said that's what he heard, and he said it was close. And he said that when he sits there like that, he said he'll pull his bill of his cap down. So looking straight ahead, something can't see his eyes very good, but he can cut his eyes to the side and catch things in his peripheral vision. He said he'd been sitting there for a good 20 minutes or so, at least, and he caught some movement to his right. And he said he looked over there again, and he saw some more movement. And then he saw something actually come out of the brush, but he couldn't focus his eyes on it for some reason. And so he raised his head up and turned his head enough that where he was looking at it, and he said it was a young Bigfoot. He said it was built about like a high school, a really in good shape, big high school linebacker. Had a narrow waist, wide shoulders. He said it was at least 6.5 feet tall. He said it was really light colored when he looked at it. He said it was very light colored. He said right at first he thought it was white. But then he realized where it was standing, the sun was shining down through the treetops on it. And he said the hair on it, not fur, but hair, was shimmering. He said it was real shiny, and it was highly reflective. He said it was standing there just staring at him. He said it was squared away, staring straight at him. And he said that he couldn't really get a reading on the thing's attitude. But he said he wasn't 30 feet from it. And he said all the thing he knew was he didn't want to provoke it. He said he was unarmed, and he said that thing could have torn him to shreds. Because Tal is not a big guy. And he said so he sort of kept his eyes down, but he was trying to look at it. He said it was very hard to focus on it because of the reflective quality of its hair. And he said sometimes it would look sort of whitish and it would look silvery. And he said sometimes it would look almost like it was mirrored. And he said sometimes it would look like fiberglass angel hair, sort of. But he said it changed as he was sitting there looking at it. They sat there and looked at each other for a period of time. And he said, then the thing sort of goes like that, sort of like he was put out with him or something. And he said the thing turned away from him and goes walking back along the creek. But he said as it walked away, he said it started looking transparent to him, partially transparent. He said about that time, he said it had walked about 30 feet away from him. He said, so at this point, it's 55 to 60 feet from him. He began to see glimpses of it's like looking at a fuzzy x-ray of its spine. Just turned around and looked at him again. And he said, as it turned back around, he could see through the transparency of his hair, the partial bone structure of the thing. And he said it looked at him for a few seconds and growled at him again. And he said it turned back around and goes walking away. And he said the thing just faded out. He said it did not walk into the woods. He said it was walking in the clear down this old roadbed. And he said by the time it got 100 feet away from him, he said it had just faded away. And he had not told anybody about that until he told me about it the other day. He had told me that he had something he was wanting to talk to me about, but he had been trying to get his courage up to talk to another researcher about it. And he had even mentioned it to Nathan, that he had something he was wanting to talk about. But he asked me if I had ever seen anything like that. And I said, no. I said, I had seen them with extremely shiny hair, that the hair sort of shimmered, but almost like it was waxed or polished or something. I mean, that's the thing. I've told people that the ones on our farm always look like they just came from the beauty parlor, like they've just had their hair done or something, and it's their hair is real shiny. But I've never seen one that shimmered like that I couldn't focus my eyes on. However, I had an incident happen back in the late 1980s where I saw one run into a thicket right off of a cutover area that was one of these thickets like this. It was impenetrable briars and such. It's an area that I knew very well and had deer hunted in that area since back when I was about 15 years old. And I saw one run full speed into this thicket. And it was like what that police officer had described. It didn't move a leaf. It didn't make any wake through it. It didn't knock anything down. It left no path, no trail through there.
Thank you, everyone, for joining us for our first episode with Coonbo. We like to keep things to about an hour, so come back and see us for part 2, and more from our brother Tim Becker. Please keep in mind, if you decide to step off the pavement, if you decide to step off the trail, and get back into places where people normally don't go, you need to be mentally, physically, and emotionally prepared for what you may encounter. God bless. Take care. We love you. And until next time, have a good evening.